final countdown has begun. Good evening, I'm Stanley Burke, and tonight the decision taken by Canadians over 3 years ago will be realized. Canada will cease to exist as a sovereign nation. The years of discussion, preparation are over. Tonight the culmination as Canadians assume their duties and obligations as citizens of the United States of America. The end of the dream of Laurier and Macdonald, the triumph of 1776 and the Continental Congress. Here in our studio, Barbara Frum is talking with 3 people who have been deeply engaged in the Union controversy. She'll be asking them for their assessment of today's events. Also, we'll be hearing from 2 people well known to Canadian viewers, journalists Larry Zolf and Barry Callahan, and their perennial debate comes tonight from our Winnipeg studios. The process of incorporating the institutions of one nation into another, it's a process, it's a lengthy one. Today's events are neither a beginning nor an end. This is rather the occasion chosen to be the symbolic culmination. For most Canadians, the focus of attention will be on the official ceremonies later tonight in Ottawa, the capital of a disappearing nation. Preparations for the President's visit have been going on throughout the day at the imposing Department of Cultural Affairs building. The mood of Ottawa is quiet but tense. The streets are unnaturally empty. Unprecedented security precautions have been taken, and the entire Parliament Hill area has been cordoned off. We understand that the motorcade bringing the President from Uplands Airport is arriving at any moment. And we take you now to Ottawa, where David Homer will describe the events. David Homer.
Now the President's car approaches the Ministry building up this very long, beautiful avenue flanked by symbolic maple trees. Immediately behind the President's car in the cavalcade is the car carrying the Secret Service men. The Royal Canadian Mounted Police at the base of the long ramp. There's the American ambassador to Ottawa. The President now out of his car. The American ambassador now greets the President and introduces him to the American leaders, the Governor General and the Prime Minister. David Davies, who's been a frequent emissary to Washington during the negotiations between the 2 governments. Commander Joseph Woods, the personal aide to the President, is there. Now the official party proceeds up the long ramp toward the waiting crowd. The invited audience consists mainly of members of the Federal Service and their families, the parliamentary staff, and members of the diplomatic missions. Many of these people tonight marks the formal end of the road as Ottawa ceases to be the seat of government. Naturally, there's a lot of work remaining to be done before the integration of the 2 administrations can be completed, but the end is nonetheless in sight. Some of these people, of course, will be going to Washington with the new senators and congressmen. It's interesting that this is the President's first trip to the Canadian capital, and he comes and goes as the President. The ambassador, too, of course, the federation which tonight's ceremonies formalize, and which he has worked so hard to bring about, this will put him out of a job, and many sources here in Ottawa speculate that he might be appointed to Mexico City. Now the party has proceeded to the top of the ramp at the base of the Ministry building. The President and the party will proceed into the Ministry building for a short private reception, and then they will come back out again to address the crowd and the nation. Until then, we take you back to the studios.
As Ottawa prepares for the end of its history as a capital, 5 other cities across the nation prepare to enter into a new phase in theirs. Tonight, Edmonton, Regina, Winnipeg, Toronto, and Halifax become capitals of 5 new states of the Union. They'll be joined, of course, by Victoria, as the newly named state of Victoria moves from its associate statehood of the past 4 years into full political union. Tomorrow, the premiers of the Maritimes, Ontario, Manitoba, Saskatchewan, and Alberta will assume the powers of acting governors under interim constitutional arrangements, and the machinery of state elections will be set in motion. With the demise of Canada and the end of the long tug of war with Ottawa, the provinces are off to seek their fortunes in an older and larger federation. In each of these cities there are celebrations tonight, a mood of excitement tinged with some apprehension as the giant step is taken. And across Canada, mixed reactions. Several Canadian Legion branches are holding last post ceremonies in protest. Here and there, black flags are being flown. In business and labor circles, again, a mixed reaction. Labor leaders are looking forward to moderately increased standards of living. In Bay Street, some concern over short-term dislocation, but on the whole, optimism as Canada becomes part of the largest and most powerful nation on earth. Earlier this evening, at points along the 3,000 miles of the border which has hitherto divided us, crowds began gathering for the formal dissolution of that border. With our cameras at one such point, our reporter, Roger Hyman, and earlier this evening he sent this report. Roger?
Falls is perhaps the most famous border point on what has been called the world's longest undefended frontier, and which later tonight will be a frontier no longer. Behind me is the Rainbow Bridge across the falls. Tonight, this bridge will cease to mark the border between two sovereign nations. The customs offices will close forever, and traffic following this route will find itself flowing freely between the state of New York and the new state of Ontario. People have already begun to gather here, as at other border points across the land, ready for the moment when later tonight a brief ceremony will mark the dissolving of the border. One way people have chosen to signify the adoption of American citizenship is to walk into the neighboring state and to return to Canada, which will have acquired its new status. Across the bridge in Niagara Falls, New York, signs of welcome have been erected. And for this evening and all day tomorrow, which has been declared a holiday, the customary bridge tolls are being waived. Instead, everyone who crosses is to receive a specially minted medallion commemorating the occasion. However, here as elsewhere, the opening of the border will be getting a mixed reception. True to form, the protest groups have begun arriving, prepared, presumably for the last time, to reiterate their plea for an independent Canada. But it's only a remnant of the crowd that once could be relied upon to support the nationalist slogans. Some of them have already left for Quebec and further afield. Most have acquiesced and accepted the inevitable. But by far, the vast majority of the people here are protesting nothing. Indeed, there's an almost festive air in Niagara Falls this evening. I have with me a young couple who are visiting the falls. How do you feel about the situation here tonight?
Well, I don't think it makes much difference, really. I don't mind. You know, we're a province, now we're a state. It doesn't seem to me any different.
You don't feel personally involved in the situation?
No, not really, no.
It doesn't bother you to lose your Canadian citizenship?
Well, I really don't think it's going to be any different. We've always been Americans, as far as I can see. We're the same.
And how do you feel about becoming an American?
Oh, I feel about the same. It doesn't concern me really one way or the other. We've got along with them for last several years, and I don't think things are going to change that much now that this has happened. So I'm not worried about it at all.
Do you feel there's a danger that some of the violence south of the border will be inherited up here now that the border is going to disappear?
Well, I think maybe it must have been always anyway. I mean, I really don't feel there is much difference, and I don't think it's going to affect my personal life. I don't think it will affect anybody's personal life.
And how about the protesters behind us here? Do you think they have a legitimate point to make?
Well, this group, has protested a lot, and I don't think it's particularly significant that they happen to be protesting again, and it's sort of silly to keep it on after all this time.
Thank you very much. This is Roger Hyman, returning you to Countdown Canada in our studios.
Thank you, Roger. Now over to Barbara Frum and her guests. Barbara?
Tonight in the studio, three men who've been deeply involved in the arguments, the politics of the events leading up to tonight's ceremonies of federation. They are Abraham Rothstein, economist and editor of Canadian Forum, Stephen Clarkson, political scientist, active in the Liberal Party, and Michael Cross, historian and an original member of the Waffle Movement of the New Democratic Party. We've been talking about continental federation in this country for about a decade now. All three of these men have been involved in the arguments and debates and controversies. We're going to ask them tonight how those arguments and how the events seem this evening, now that the event has finally happened. However, before we hear the comments of our guests, we're going to play for you again a portion of the Prime Minister's announcement of his plan to seek union with the United States and his now classic statement of the rationale behind that decision.
I have today initiated negotiations at the highest level designed to bring into line the political, judicial, economic, and social institutions of our two nations with a view to the eventual union of those nations in a continental federation. I have at the same time called the National Constitutional Conference to place before the provincial governments and the Canadian people draft proposals for the constitutional procedures necessary to expedite this process in accordance with the requirements of democratic legality. This announcement will come to you as no surprise. It fulfills the intentions avowed by my government at the time of the last general election. Nevertheless, I believe it would be appropriate for me to reiterate the position which my government has taken on the question of Canadian sovereignty and the principles which lie behind today's action. The opponents of our policy of continental union are fond of claiming that we are surrendering to external pressures. Let me repeat that the foundation of our policy is the recognition and acceptance of realities. If in recent years we have felt the pull toward union with the United States as a pressure, that is precisely because the political realities, the economic realities of the present have grown beyond the forms and institutions of the past. We have been attempting to contain a new set of conditions in old structures. The policy of my predecessors in office, their efforts to preserve the unity and sovereignty of Canada, succeeded only in exposing the strength and diversity of those forces in our national life which have propelled us beyond the philosophy of nationalism. They clearly exposed the fact that the assertion of Canadian nationalism in the face of the economic pressures which our neighbor would most certainly have been obliged to exert in pursuit of her own legitimate interests, this nationalist assertion would have entailed hardship and sacrifice in one region of our country after another, in one segment of our economy after another. Does a government have a right to commit its people to sacrifice for the sake of an idea, however precious that idea may seem? Further, does a government have the right to lead a country toward a state of enmity with a great and powerful neighbor merely for the sake of an idea? It would have been the gravest kind of political irresponsibility to have continued to provoke the hostility of the United States, especially when the means to resolve our differences lay so near at hand. For we are now seeking to settle our conflicts by the oldest yet never more progressive solution of joining our two families, merging the interests which threatened to divide us. Make no mistake, I fully realize that the months and years ahead will contain moments of difficulty for every Canadian. But I would ask you this: what are we really giving up? What are we really losing? And what do we stand to gain? At this moment of world history, is nationalism really anything more than a sentimental attachment to common memories?
Gentlemen, let me ask you first how the Prime Minister's statement sounds to you tonight, all his arguments about the inevitability of this move that has been formalized tonight.
Well, it was a loss of political guts 3 years ago, and we're reaping the rewards of that. It was not inevitable. It was just a wrong decision that he's made, and we're now suffering.
The assumption that nationalism was an idea, as a kind of old-fashioned rationalism that, as Stephen said, didn't make sense 3 years ago and doesn't make sense today.
So you discount entirely this idea of a sentimental attachment to our common memories?
It was something real, Canada. It's still something real to me.
What about this idea? Because he keeps saying that it's just facing reality. He's been saying this now for many years.
Well, what's the reality? The reality is that we were in a very dependent relationship with the United States, and his decision was to make it more dependent, arguing that there was too much of an economic sacrifice involved in becoming more independent. The problem was with the argument is that we were losing economically because of the dependence. What we should have done is what Quebec did, which is become more independent and get control over our own economy, which would reduce the cost of dependence.
So you also don't agree with him that economic hardship was a necessity?
No, it's a whole series of arguments that the anti-nationalists have been using, or the so-called internationalists, arguing for continental integration. And it's something that we've been fighting all the way along, and the signs were very good in the early 70s. We had been developing a continental, at least in opposition to the continental energy policy. We had been developing, Canadian control over television and radio, and all across the front, Arctic sovereignty. It all seemed to be good. And then there's this loss of leadership, loss of feeling and that we can do it, which leads to this integration.
What the Prime Minister shares with a good deal of this country is the fear that the worst evil that could happen was that we would go berserk on nationalism. And in maintaining and feeding this fear, they were prepared to let the whole country go down the drain rather than give way to any danger that appeared to be nationalistic. It's one of these peculiar hang-ups in history which will come out as a great paradox to any other people, that they could not, with some good conscience, stand up for their own interests.
It's interesting you used the word berserk in relation
Yes.
to nationalism.
Yes.
Why did those two things get mixed?
Which two things?
The notion that one could go berserk on nationalism.
There's a peculiar hangover of 19th century rationalism, that the idea being that something that couldn't be reduced to an arithmetic equation, such as concern for one's country, was therefore not valid. The fear that we would get carried away, the sense that the whole country would go off on a hysterical binge. And in this country of all places, where the economy is almost entirely eroded, where we've given away the natural resources, where the media was full of American programs, the notion that a country in this position is ready to go berserk on nationalism seems to me one of the most peculiar obsessions that ever hit any country.
Michael, what about that notion of not wanting to risk enmity with a great and powerful neighbor? It almost sounded like sort of, it's not David and Goliath, is it? It's another one, but...
It's a curious notion that presumably you don't want to risk enmity so that you won't be taken over. So to avoid risking that, you hand yourself over. It's a very curious kind of political equation that's being made here.
And again, a sort of loss of guts, because it's been part of the Canadian-American relationship right from the beginning, a certain tension.
Well, this is
between
the
Canada and
difference
States.
between this situation. You know, annexation is not something new, and let's stop fooling around calling it federation. It's annexation. It's the old thing that we've had in this country since the United States invited us in 1775. We've had it umpteen times. We've resisted it every time. The difference this time is that we don't have leaders with guts.
Do you think that the most convincing argument was the one of economic hardship, though? This notion that no government leader has the right to commit its people to economic hardship for the sake of an idea.
We've done that. We did that since 1867. We've always paid an economic price for being Canadians. You know, that price was a 1/3 lower standard of living. You know, where is this crunch point that Canadians are not prepared to pay beyond this point? No one has ever really asked Canadians where that point lies.
But it's
Except, you know, they have made this decision, though, at the poll.
But it's a superficial appreciation of the problem of economic hardship. What they are really saying is that there was no forward planning of alternatives, the ways in which we got locked in to our various continental agreements, with the United States sort of having something over our heads that they would suspend these. That was the problem. We had nothing to fall back on. And so it became an all-or-nothing game. And it wasn't economic hardship, but lack of political foresight.
All right, we have to stop. I'm sorry. We'll be back in 30 seconds.
Imperial Military Industrial Incorporated takes pride in presenting coverage of these momentous events in the history of our continent and of the Western world. It is our privilege to join in welcoming Canadians into this union of peoples, races, creeds, this supreme achievement of vision, technology, and the democratic will, the United States of America. Never have the words in the Great Seal of the United States held more meaning than today. A pluribus unum. Out of the many, one.
Once passions have cooled, and we can discuss later whether or not you think they will cool, but let's go after the notion about whether or not this really matters. Does it really matter to Canadians? Does it matter to the world? Will it make any difference to the United States?
I think it matters. It's a disaster in all terms, world terms, North American terms, Canadian terms. The United States has lost a very significant critic in North America that can oppose its foreign policy if it, for instance, in Asia or in Africa where it's wrong.
I suppose we can have a debate on that one right now, though. Does that matter? Was that ever significant, really? Or are we just maintaining false pride in the past?
I think it's really a matter of options. I'm reminded of the famous statement made some over 50 years ago, which I would paraphrase as, I have seen the future and it doesn't work. In regard to the racial problems, the urban problems, the pollution problems, and the political problems, what we need most of all, and what we could have served for the world, is an option in North America to the difficulties and the mistakes into which the United States has got its own society. And now that option is foreclosed.
I agree with Abe completely that Canada was essentially a future, a kind of technological society which didn't have to go the way that the United States is going. You know, we see now this future lost. Canada's shackled itself to a corpse, and it's going to go down with that corpse.
However bloated and gigantic the one.
So the United States loses and we lose because we're going to, the cost, you know, we were talking about the economic cost, the social cost for us is going to be enormous. We're going to adopt and absorb all the social crises that the states have and that we were trying to avoid.
And in world terms, surely there's going to be a lot of shuddering in a lot of countries that America's new style imperialism that we've been watching for the last 30 years is now beginning to be old style imperialism. They've actually taken over and absorbed one of their satellites. Every other satellite is going to be a little more frightened now.
What about our impact within the new federation? What difference will Canadians make will Canada make?
Well, again, that's going to depend on the leadership that comes from our remaining government. If it continues to be this kind of the logical consequence of this annexation is simply to be good little boys within the American Union. If it's what I would like, it would be much more subversive.
All these values, though, that you say we represented, will they find any outlet in the Federation?
Yes, it's going to be of great entertainment value. We will assume the role of the Old South. We will be the Old North. We will have the RCMP riding around and canoeing up. We'll be canoeing up and down the rivers, and the entertainment value should be boundless for the rest of the continent.
And the funny part is we may even become the Old South economically in the United States, the depressed area, a great new Appalachia north of the 49th parallel.
But seriously, I think that what we have to have is a secession movement. And the analogy with the South, although you're the historian, Michael, I don't think holds. Because we have a different culture, we have a different political tradition.
You don't think that will be lost? You don't think time will just...
Well, that depends on us and our leadership, but I don't think we will lose it if we don't want to. And this is the basis, just as we will have seen in Quebec. I would suspect that Quebec is going to do much better as an independent state than we will as dependent, states of the American Union.
Well, I don't think any one of us is going to argue that we've got to keep the secession idea alive somehow, but it's going to be a very difficult process. Look, we can't kid ourselves about that. We're outnumbered 10-1 in this union. They can use military power against us in a way they never could in the past. As long as we were independent, we had the opinion of the world on our side in any struggles with the United States. We've given that up, and we've given it up for nothing.
Sorry, I have to interrupt you, gentlemen. We've established a link with the Radio-Télévision Québécoise to bring you part of a press conference now on in Montreal, given by a group called the Canadian Liberation Front. Out of Montreal. It's understood that the group there is a coalition of radical nationalists and the American political refugees who have declared their intention to continue their struggle against what they term the American takeover from the Republic of Quebec. Press conference is already underway.
We make the following public demands. Immediate repeal of the Amalgamation Act joining Canada and the United States. Release and amnesty for all interned political prisoners. Removal of all trade restrictions currently levied as political pressure on the independent state of Quebec. Establishment of an international review board including the sovereign nations of China and the Free African Congress. The immediate sharing of true information of the real nature of the American occupation. The immediate repeal of such laws as prohibit the organization, operation, and function of the Canadian Liberation Front in occupied territory. The 6 demands included here are only considered to be the basic minimum requirement to begin the process of establishing Canada as a sovereign nation and restoring the freedom of the Canadian people. These demands are therefore non-negotiable. In conclusion, we implore the world to witness that the people of Canada have been tricked into accepting a political and economic occupation by an imperialist foreign power who, in desperate need of so-called resources, have circumvented all international agreements. The United States of America has succeeded in occupying Canada only after 15 years of political and economic infiltration and coercion. The Canadian Liberation Front exists to oppose the imperialist tyranny. Power to the people. Power to the people.
Well, a lot of questions now. I've got some. Do you really believe that there's any chance of Canada regaining its sovereignty?
Yeah! We wouldn't be here if we didn't think that.
Well, how do you account for the fact that Canadians chose to join the U.S. democratically?
We don't believe that the process used to coerce and intimidate the people of Canada and withhold information from the people of Canada is a democratic process.
What coercion?
I think the answer to that question is obvious.
How do you explain, or how are you going to justify the possible outcome of your confrontation? Surely you must think that there's going to be violence. Surely you must know, you must be planning on a violent confrontation. There's someone up there with a gun.
Well, we don't expect the confrontation to be violent at this point.
But what about in the future?
You've got to protect yourself. Once you decide to maintain this position, you've got to protect yourself.
I'm sorry, I didn't hear that reply.
And extinguish some of the lies that are existing today.
Once again?
You want to go ahead and do that?
Go ahead. Our first job right now is expose some of the lies that are existing today and extinguish them.
Could I ask a somewhat tactical question? Where do you plan to get your financial support from for your movement?
Revolution isn't always necessarily have to be financed. The Canadian people have been forced to accept government from without the boundaries of Canada. You know, so here's a guy like me. You know, I don't like Yankees, you know, and all of a sudden, like tonight, I'm going to be a Yankee. And I'm not into that trip, you know. Okay, groovy, you know, I can handle that trip too. And that's why I got this, you know. So therefore, wait a minute, I was happy as a Canadian, you know. There's no way on earth that I'm going to be happy as an American. So I might as well.
Of your Liberation Front are entering into this confrontation with an entirely naive head without any idea of where you're going. If you think that people are just going to flock towards you, you know, come on in, baby, we're all coming. You've got another thing coming.
Could I ask if that reporter has any alternative that he would like to share with the Canadian Liberation Front?
That's quite a different tone and feeling in Quebec tonight. How do you react to the statements of the Canadian Liberation Front, the notion of actual armed combat now within this new federation?
It's kind of hard to react because, you know, it's the kind of presence that puts people off, and all the nice middle-class people are going to get very uptight about these kids, which is unfortunate because I think we've got to keep all our options open at this stage. We've got to get as wide a spectrum of resistance as possible. And these kids, and maybe their violence, are going to be necessary elements in our resistance.
But you believe within the upset of the situation is possible?
Yeah, I think they're speaking for us. They're our conscience in a way, as the youth have been for a long time. And what the viewers shouldn't make any mistake about this. It's not just a few kids who are going to be upset. I think that the popular decision was an erroneous one, and the Canadian people are going to wake up very soon and find that this mirage of greater prosperity is a mirage. And they're going to support an attempt to reverse the decision and to turn back and get back onto an independent path. So I think there is going to be much more support for this than it appears just from that press conference.
All right, but what about its possible success? That's a different thing. I mean, these people are talking about actual armed combat with Americans.
I think the success is very real. Our guerrilla movement is going to make it very uncomfortable for the United States when you consider the number of native guerrilla movements they have operating in the United States. It's not only going to be Canadians who are resisting, it's Americans. We can make a link up with dissident groups within the United States itself and free Canada.
Whatever meaning there really is in Canadian history centers on the theme of survival. And I myself regard it now as the opening of the longest and most difficult chapter in that theme.
Do you see this struggle? How do you see it resolving itself? That's what's in question. I mean, are you going to see another vote? Are you going to ask for another referendum? What could happen?
Well, as a Liberal, what I plan to do is trying to mobilize support for a new referendum, for a reassessment of this decision, which is rather like, when you buy an appliance from a salesman at the door, you've got a right to reconsider after a while. And I think we should reconsider, and there are a lot of people who support this. All of the, the people I work with politically support this. I imagine that the Waffle Group would be as, if not stronger, pressing for reconsideration. There must be some rights of a state to secede from a union. Formally it should be in the Constitution, and it's a right for people to determine their destiny. We've made an erroneous decision. I think we've got to redo it.
And you think the redoing is possible?
I think that it will take perhaps much more time than we expect. It may certainly not center on the events of the next few years, but what we have to nourish is the Canadian sense of its own nationhood, and my feeling is that this will work itself through over a long period of time and work itself out.
Are you maybe underestimating the countermeasures possible, though? I mean, why would the Americans allow this kind of secession? And surely they would have means to prevent it.
Why did we allow Quebec to secede? Because it was impossible, even if we'd wanted to do anything about it. There's a respect for Quebec, the Quebecers' right to decide their own future.
Once again, I'm going to have to interrupt our studio guests, Abe Rothstein, Stephen Clarkson, and Michael Cross, to introduce two more guests, Larry Zolf and Barry Callahan, both, as you know, longtime analysts of the North American scene for radio and television, and they're in our Winnipeg studios tonight.
Most part, like it or not, for the most part. That is the vast majority. Toronto the Good, the Orange Lodge, the British tradition, connections to Britain, etc., etc. It's in the 50s and 60s that we start to change. The name of the game, change to what? Exactly. Change to what? Exactly. Now you say, in essence, we are part of the continent. We should absorb the moral vitality of the United States, which is debating fundamental issues.
No, you keep
and
misinterpreting every time what I... No.
America.
You keep misinterpreting every time what I say.
What
I say that we must
creating
look
a different
to ourselves.
society
Exactly.
Here. All right.
We must look and see what it is that we are in ourselves. Not waste energy in superficially denouncing the Americans as evil or the French Canadians as tribal racists, but to say, what is it that we are? And it is not a satisfactory answer.
Well, what we are...
To say that what we are is this eclectic gathering, that includes Don Creighton, George Grant, the Toronto Star, Pierre Trudeau, anybody can get into the ball game and say, I'm a nationalist. All of a sudden, Joe Green, if you remember, was an ardent nationalist.
So what?
If ever there was a political opportunist, that is, the so what is that it didn't tell us anything about ourselves, didn't make us anything ourselves as independent from the United States. It was a shrill wind.
Can you agree to this? That if we have ceased being something, and we have ceased being British North America, then what happens in a period of a 20-year gap is an attempt to become something else.
That's right.
Now, my argument is that essentially what you're saying is that Creighton wished to turn the clock back, Grant wished to turn the clock back. I deny both of those premises completely and totally. I'm saying that Creighton, Grant, the Toronto Star, Pierre Elliott Trudeau, may his memory be a blessing, and all these people, for better or for worse, were trying to create something else. They failed, lamentably and totally, because look at the situation we are in right now. But I am arguing, and I'm arguing strenuously, that the idea of creating a separate identity, having here, keeping what we have in our roots, i.e. keeping the parliamentary system, which in my humble opinion is a good thing, keeping certain of these traditions that we have built up over the years, because I don't see them as totally evil, and arguing that the British fact has been one unmitigated disaster in Canadian history is total nonsense.
But nobody is arguing that. You keep talking to a straw man. I've said none of those things.
Well, you're talking to a straw man.
I'm saying that we had to seize upon ourselves as soon as we got rid of the British North America fact. We had to become what we were. We wasted a whole lot of energy.
And I suggest that English Canadians wasted a whole lot of
Canadians.
Now, what about the waste of energy of French Canadians? Let's focus in on that for a second.
No, wait a minute.
What about the waste of energy as we were sitting there muddled with no identity worth speaking about, but at least an attempt to create what I would call a pan-Canadian nationalism. Certainly not a refusal, bar the French Canadian. Creighton is not saying that. Grant is not saying that. Anything but that. What they're asking is to share with the French Canadians an attempt to create a different identity on this side of the continent.
What Creighton said to the French... No, wait a minute.
At this stage of the game, let me finish one important point. At this stage of the game, René Lévesque, Jacques Parizeau, Claude Chiron, and all the vast majority of the intellectual elite, if you like, in Quebec, was busy fighting an Anglo-Saxon boogeyman that no longer existed. And having triumphed over this non-existent straw man, they find themselves today sharing the entire continent with the United States of great North America. And what are they going to do? How are they going to solve the St. Lawrence Seaway problem? How are they going to solve any of their joint transportation problems, their economic problems, everything else? What they are calling for themselves, what they're going to have, is debt.
I get the point.
Debt.
The point is that up until 1970, René Lévesque was prepared to do business with English Canada.
Could it possibly be that René Lévesque did not explain himself too well?
He made himself clear time after time after time. The trouble is he ran into guys like Donald Creighton who said, look, in the original business done in 1867, there was no mention of special language rights. There was no mention of this. There was no mention of that. And we're adhering to 1867. Now, that's what Creighton said. Now, any self-respecting French Canadian at that time, a Quebecois who was trying to survive politically, culturally, and morally, could accept that legalistic view of what it was to be a Canadian.
Can you explain
to me? That was the problem.
Can you explain to me if this was such...
It was a combination
such a ridiculous...
of that legalism and the hysterical view that you have, that they were tribal racists.
I would
led
argue
them to the extreme position that they were in and left us with nothing but an eclectic view of what it was to be an English Canadian.
Two points. One, if the British experience was so all stultifying and death-creating, how did they manage to survive as a separate entity in the North American continent?
I'm not talking about the British experience.
Just let me finish my point.
English-speaking Canadian.
The difference between Maine and Vermont and Quebec is in itself a glowing example of the idiocy of what you're saying. In the American experiment, we all bless America, we all salute the flag, we all speak English, we all die in Vietnam, we all fight communism in the abstract, and we have to create our own mythology because you have to create a melting pot.
All through the 70s, they were stomping all over the flag and refusing to go to Vietnam.
America is a creation of 7th or 18th century rationalists, some abstract ideal, everybody has to adhere to it. Whatever our faults were in Canada, French Canadians were allowed to remain French Canadians. Catholics were allowed to have separate schools. People were allowed, if you like, to muddle through.
To misunderstand the whole French Canadian Revolution. They were allowed to remain an agrarian society. They revolted against that. They tried to become something else. And our response was one of misunderstanding and hysteria and legalism. And there's no point in talking to me about the United States if it was some weird abstraction.
We'll leave Messrs. Zolf and Callahan in a debate which will go on well beyond tonight. Now back to Ottawa, where the Governor-General is already speaking. Following his speech, the last official act of his career, President Lam will address the Canadian people in the closing moments of their career as a nation.
My feelings at this moment are difficult to describe. Addressing you here, I feel that I am seeing you off on a journey from which you will never return, and on which I cannot accompany you. And in a sense, this is true. As a private citizen, I shall, of course, assume with you a new identity. But the office of Governor-General can go no further. The history of that office terminates with the history of Canada. I therefore, in my final official capacity, wish you well in a future which does not include the Queen's representative. To every one of you, young and old, I bid Godspeed.
Ladies and gentlemen, the President. My friends, in a very little while, I shall address you as my fellow Americans. And I can assure you that no words will ever have been spoken with more pride or more heartfelt pleasure. As President, I am proud and happy that my term of office should have seen the union of our two peoples achieved. Indeed, I regard this day's event, which has been my privilege to promote, as the most important accomplishment of this administration. Historians of ancient Rome record that the eulogy to a dead emperor proclaimed the territories which had been conquered in his name and during his reign. And it is a mark of the great gap that divides us from that era that my proudest claim to remembrance will be that during my term of office as the elected president of a free people, the Canadian nation, our oldest friend and ally, freely determined to join her fortunes with ours. We deeply trust that the act of self-determination that you have made will prove to you to have been a fulfilling one. I believe it will. And indeed, your choice has confronted the American nation with a great and challenging responsibility. We believe ourselves to be the bearers of a priceless heritage, the tradition of democratic freedom. We believe that the American nation has been entrusted with an historic mission to guard that heritage against the threats of alien ideologies and the pressures created at home by the rapidity of social change. And whether we will it or no, we find ourselves compelled to defend this heritage by force of arms in foreign conflict. Thus, when a neighboring nation, a traditional friend whose history has run parallel to ours, determines to enter into political union with us, it is a challenge to us to see that the present state of our national life is worthy of this high tribute. Recently, we celebrated the 200th anniversary of the Declaration of Independence, the act in which the American nation declared its sovereign identity and proclaimed the ideals for which it stands today. Canada chose a different path, preferring to maintain the adherence to the parent country. Lines were drawn on the map of this continent, lines which were gradually extended westward to the Pacific. The two nations grew up to different destinies under different institutions. Yet all the while, it has seemed that the lines which divided us were fictions, artificially bisecting the natural unity of this continent and artificially separating us, the joint inheritors of its abundance. And so it is that I view today as bringing to completion the historical process whose finest moment was in the year 1776. So, as President, I take pride for America from the meaning of today's events. But also, if I may introduce a personal note, the linking of our two nations gives me great pleasure as an individual. In the Great War against the fascist tyranny in Europe, it was my privilege to serve alongside Canadian fighting men and to learn to respect them as among the finest soldiers in the Allied armies. It is a high honor for me, therefore, to become their commander-in-chief and to know that in any future conflict we shall fight under the same flag. We trust, however, that our common destiny lies not in war, but in peace and prosperity. Here, as in the sphere of political ideals, the uniting of our countries is an important event for our civilization. It has been America's privilege and task to lead the world in the application of technology to resources for the progress and betterment of mankind. In finally achieving the integration into a single system of the resources and the economic and industrial potential of this continent, we have cleared the way for their most thorough and effective exploitation. It hardly needs to be pointed out that Canadians themselves will be among the first to share in the benefits which must flow from the unlocking of this vast potential. At this point, I would like to address a word to those who have sincerely and honestly opposed the union of our two nations. Let me say that I understand and respect your sentiments. Like all of history's forward steps, this has been a painful one to take. It is natural that strong feelings should have been aroused, and that these should have found strong expression. Occasionally, firm means were needed to ensure that the strength of their expression remained within the limits acceptable to civil society. I hereby invite all those who saw fit to oppose this union to join with us now in putting aside all rancor and division, accepting what has been determined upon by the will of the majority. The time has come for us to join together, recognizing that the function of dissent ceases once the decision has been made. My friends, this is a solemn occasion, but it is also a happy one. Let me conclude by reminding you of a fact which has been raised by my advisors. Showing me a map of the North American continent, they pointed out that in point of size, Canada is considerably larger than the United States. In a very important sense, then, Canada is not joining the United States. On the contrary, we are joining you. My fellow Americans, welcome and thank you.
We'll return to Ottawa in a few moments for the end of tonight's ceremony, but first to Niagara Falls, where Roger Hyman has reports on violence there, a turbulent reception, part of some last-ditch opponents to the idea of continental union. Roger, are you there?
Back here at Niagara Falls, the situation has taken an unexpected turn. As you can hear behind me, a group of the demonstrators who are protesting against the opening of the border have attempted to block traffic moving into New York State. The situation looks fairly ugly and looks to me like it might get uglier before the evening's out. The police are in there trying to keep order. I have here with me Chief Martin of the Niagara Falls Police Department. Chief, what do you think of this situation? Are you going to be able to handle it?
Well, I think we can handle it as long as it doesn't get any bigger than it is now.
What about reinforcements? A little while ago, we saw a group of New York State police across the bridge, fully clothed in riot gear. Are you going to call for their assistance, or have you already?
No, I haven't called for their assistance, of course, for a while yet. This is still a Canadian situation. They're American police.
Would you be prepared to call for their assistance if this situation got worse now?
No, I really can't comment upon that.
What about these kids, Chief Martin? Do you have any sympathy for their cause?
Well, not really. If they wanted to do something about this, they could have demonstrated about it a few years ago when they could have done something.
Well, you say they should have made their views known, but as you well know, they already did that and nothing happened.
Well, perhaps, but in every situation such as this, you're going to have someone that's unhappy.
May I ask what your feeling is about the opening of the border and Canada becoming an American property?
Well, I'll go along with it.
Thanks very much, Chief Martin. And you're from?
But I live in Buffalo.
You seem very upset about what's happening here tonight.
But how can you let this happen? I mean, the country's being invaded and conquered. But you really know what you're doing. I used to listen to the radio and I always thought, well, that's Canada, you know. But now it's all finished.
Thank you. You didn't ask us to fight your wars. You told us. You gave our country away. You didn't ask us. You gave it away.
Here in Ottawa and all over this great land that was Canada, the maple leaf flag is lowered for the last time. Our new flag, the Star-Spangled Banner, is now being raised. Ladies and gentlemen, our national anthem.